So this morning I want to talk about the book called Martyr's Mirror or the Bloody Theater. You can see it on, talks about it here in Wikipedia. You can find it on Amazon.com if you want to buy it, or even on eBay. It's a little expensive. It's over 1,000 pages. It costs around $40 to $45. I urge anyone who has not read it before to get it. It was a staple among the books that were at home when I was living with my siblings and my mom and dad. I read a lot of it, and it has shaped my personal beliefs in such a way as you will understand. When you read it, you will understand why I say the things that I say concerning Christianity. The Martyr's Mirror or the Bloody Theater, first published in Holland in 1660 in Dutch by Thieleman J. van Braght, documents the stories and testimony of Christian martyrs, especially Anabaptists. Now, I want to explain. Yes, the Anabaptists did consider themselves Christian. How did they start? Well, just a couple of people, and then it spread like wildfire all over Europe. Water baptism was supposed to be total immersion. The Sabbath day instead of Sunday was to be kept. They even tried to keep the Jewish religious holidays. They even said that had to be kept. And so they were told by the Christian authority of the day, which was either the Catholics or the Protestants, well then that means you've got to be circumcised too. And they said, no, that's not true. We're not going to be circumcised. In other words, you're Jews, is the statement that the Christian authorities were making. Also, the Anabaptists did not believe in church and state. They did not believe of the church running the state. And it is the influence of the Martyr's Mirror that helped shape and establish the United States. Believe it or not. I'll show you. The Bloody Theater of Martyr Mirror of the defenseless Christians who baptized only upon the confession of faith and who suffered and died for the testimony as they're quoting here, Jesus, their Savior, from the time of, as they say, Christ, of the year AD, all the way from that point from 0 to 1660. Now, before I get rolling on this, I want to explain a few things. You see, these folks, these Anabaptists, they were getting closer and closer to the truth. They did not have all the truth, but they were finding it. They were getting there. They would eventually, if they hadn't already, would have realized, as I do, that the name of the Messiah is not Jesus at all, but Yehoshua. And they may already have known this, and they may already have talked about it, but the problem is, and as I pointed out, it was in 1611. 1611 now. Now think about this for a minute, because the Anabaptists were in jolly old England as well. It was only in 1611 that the King James Version of the Bible was changed from Yehoshua to Jesus. So that means, think about this carefully, folks, that means that the Anabaptists were saying Yehoshua, the ones who were in England. You see, because the Anabaptist martyrdom occurred in mostly the 1500s, but also including the 1600s. Now think about that for a minute. Who knows what the German translations were in those days? What was it really? Does anybody know? But we know that the Anabaptists in England used the name Yehoshua. We know this for a fact. I went over that just a couple of days ago. That in fact, that the King James Version changed from Yehoshua to Jesus in 1611. All right, so I'm going to continue with this. The use of the word defenseless in this case refers to Anabaptist belief in non-resistance. In other words, they did not believe in taking up the sword against their brethren. Why? Because they believed in Yehoshua's word. There were two things that were required. I pointed out over and over and over again in my videos that you keep his word, love your neighbor as yourself. That's number one. Number two, don't deny his name. Why would you deny his name? Because to deny Yehoshua's name is also to deny the Father. You shall love Jehovah, your Elohim, with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might. How do you do that? Well, one way is to not deny the name of the Son, who has the name of the Father in his name. So in those two commandments that Yehoshua gave contains the very two commandments on which hang all the law and the prophets. All right? Again, I have proven that the English Anabaptists used the name Yehoshua, not Jesus. So bear that in mind as I'm reading through this. And these people, they were just like all the other Christians of the day, and then something happened. Truth started coming out. People were studying and they found out how they were really supposed to live, and the demonic forces of church and state tried to exterminate them. Next to the Martyr's Mirror, or next to the Bible, the Martyr's Mirror has historically, well, I should start here. The book includes accounts of the martyrdom of the apostles and the stories of martyrs from previous centuries with beliefs similar to the Anabaptists. Next to the Bible, the Martyr's Mirror had historically been held most significant and prominent place in Amish and Mennonite homes. In 1745, Jacob Goschalk arranged with Ephrata Cloister to have them translate the Martyr's Mirror from Dutch into German and to print it. The work took 15 men 3 years to finish, and in 1749 at 1,512 pages. It was the largest book printed in America before the Revolutionary War. Yes, before the Revolutionary War. An original volume is on display at the Ephrata Cloister. The 1685 edition of the book is illustrated with 104 copper etchings by Jan Luyken, 31 of these plates survive and are part of the Mirror of the Martyrs exhibit at Bethel College in North Newton, Kansas. 2 of the copper plates are located at Muddy Creek Farm Library, established by Amos B. Hoover at Ephrata, Pennsylvania. The first English version, translated from German by Daniel Roop, was published by David Miller, Lampeter Square, Pennsylvania, in 1837. An edition entitled A Martyrology of the Churches of Christ was translated and printed in England in 1850 in 2 volumes by Edward Bean Underhill under the auspices of Hansard Knollys Society in England. The Martyr's Mirror differs from the Fox's Book of Martyrs in that it only includes those martyrs which were considered non-resistant, while Fox's books does not include many Anabaptist martyrs. Now, folks, okay, the reason why I say the Martyr's Mirror is because these Anabaptists were Seventh-day Sabbath keepers. And this, okay, so what I'm going to do is go back to this article right here, right, that I showed. What was it? I pointed out in an early part of this week, I believe it was, History of the Sabbath and the First Day of the Week, Part 2. And folks, this is some good reading too. Chapter 25, Sabbath Keepers During the Reformation Times from the 15th to the 17th Century. And what do we see here? Anabaptists, Sabbatarians in Moravia, right? Now, it might take to the end of time to read that whole book, this particular book, that History of the Sabbath and the First Day of the Week. But the Martyr's Mirror says, and I called my dad yesterday, I wanted to make sure that I had my information correct. And he says, yes, the Martyr's Mirror says the Anabaptists were Seventh-day Sabbath keepers. So, what I'm going to do, and like I said, they started off as Catholics and Protestants. They did. But truth started coming out. An unbroken chain of Christian Sabbath keepers extends from the Apostolic Church through the Middle Ages. At the height of the papal darkness, their light shone high up in their Alpine retreats, and their voice of warning was also heard in Eastern Europe. In spite of advancing Islam, whole bodies of them existed in Ethiopia, India, Syria, Armenia, etc. They were all over the world, folks. When the Reformation lifted a veil of darkness covering the nations, not only did traces of these Sabbath-keeping Christians appear afresh all over the old world, but simultaneously with a new life emanated from this mighty movement, Sabbatarians were found in Moravia, Bohemia, Transylvania, Germany, Holland, England, Finland, Scandinavia, yes, even as early as the 15th century, in the 1400s. You see, folks, they had quite a history in Russia, when in the 12th and 13th centuries, untying persecutors pressed true believers far into the Alps. From where? We're going to get to that in just a minute. Many of them found new retreats in Moravia and Bohemia. Amid the multitudes of a corrupt church, the persecuted few still retained a true idea of the Church of Christ, as Mosheim thus confirms. Prior to the age of Luther, there lay concealed in almost every country of Europe, but especially in Bohemia, Moravia, Switzerland, and Germany, any persons in whose minds was deeply rooted that principle which the Waldensians The Wycliffites and the Hussites maintain, some more covertly and others more openly, namely that the kingdom which, as they say, Christ set up on the earth, or the visible church, is an assembly of holy persons and ought to therefore be entirely free. This is where the United States got the term free men. Freedom from these people. Not only from ungodly persons and sinners, but from all institutions of human device against, it should read, unholiness. All right? You see, folks? And see, what I fear is, not only has this nation lost its roots, lost what it means to be free, but also many of the Anabaptists in the United States and in Europe, I mean, Mennonites, Amish, Hutterites, the Brethren, many have lost their roots, their identity. As the Reformation broke, this concealed principle sprang up with it everywhere. You see. So this concept has always been around. You could say this group was the real church, or what was left of it, while the others were frauds. And of course, once the Reformation broke forth, this concealed principle just broke out everywhere, like I said earlier in this video. Now, the Anabaptists, living faith in, as they say, Christ, which should not be said like that, it should be said Messiah, or Moshiach. See, there's a difference even between Mashiach and Moshiach. Moshiach means Savior. Mashiach in Hebrew does not mean Savior. This is the reason why we have to be careful with our words, folks. Because of this, the proper name of these believers was Baptist. Now, they are not to be confused with the current Baptists of the United States. Let me show you why. So the founding of the current Baptist church that we have, that split into the Northern Baptist Church and a Southern Baptist, is this. In 1612, Thomas Helwys established a Baptist congregation in London consisting of congregants from Smith's Church. A number of other Baptist churches sprang up, and they became known as the General Baptist. The particular Baptists were established when a group of Calvinist separatists adopted believers' baptism. Not the same. Do not confuse. Please understand the difference is what I'm saying. Okay, I don't need this anymore, so let's go back to this particular article. Living in faith in, as they say, Christ, being the test of church admission, it became evident to some that infant sprinkling must be discarded, and instead only the believer was to be buried with his master, they say Lord, by immersion upon his profession of faith to rise him to a new life. Because of this, the proper name of these believers was Baptists, but they were misnamed Rebaptists, aka Anabaptists, by their opponents. The difference between these and the Reformers are set forth by Dr. P.H. Schaff, who also styles them as radicals. The Reformers aimed to reform the old church by the Bible. The radicals attempted to build a new church from the Bible. I believe they call the Reformers, that would be the modern Martin Luther crowd, the Protestants. And the radicals would be the Anabaptists, in this man's words. The former maintained the historic continuity. The latter went Directly to the apostolic age. Imagine that. Imagine that. Weren't the apostles the real leaders of the church anyway? The 12? And the 13th being Paul. Were they not? Of course they were. So, were the Anabaptists correct by going all the way back to the apostolic age? Yes, they were right. And it says, and ignore the intervening centuries as apostasy. I would agree with them. The Reformers found a popular state church. The Reformers, understand the Reformers were the Martin Luther types, the Protestants. Founded a popular state church, including all citizens with their families. The Anabaptists organized on a voluntary principle select congregations of baptized believers separated from the world and from the state. Love not the world, and the state is a part of the world. I have always maintained this philosophy because of what I've been taught at home and what I've read in Martyr's Mirror and in the Bible. Now, I've argued with people concerning the Constitution of the United States. You know, Thomas Jefferson, he wanted a separation of church and state in the Constitution, but it was never written in the Constitution. He wanted it there. It just didn't get there. But anyway, that's a whole nother subject matter that I don't want to get into. The radical opinion spread with great rapidity, radicals being the Anabaptists, or rose simultaneously in Bern, Basel, St. Gall, Appenzell, all the upper Rhine in South Germany and Austria. The Anabaptists were driven from place to place and traveled as fugitive evangelists. They preached repentance and faith, baptized converts, organized congregations, and exercised rigid discipline. They called themselves simply the Brethren or Christians. I would say they called themselves the Brethren. This is what I know. I'm not saying they didn't call themselves Christians. I think, as I've said earlier in this particular video, if once they would have continued, if they would have allowed to have been continuing in the truth, they would eventually have found that they did not want to be called Christians. But that's a whole other subject. They were earnest and zealous, self-denying and heroic, but restless and impatient. They accepted the New Testament as their only rule of faith and practice. Should read the New Covenant, not New Testament. To say New Testament is denial of the New Covenant. Anyway, I will continue. And so far agreed with the Reformers, but utterly broke with Catholic tradition and rejected Luther's theory of forensic solidification, justification, and real presence. They emphasize the necessity of good works as written by John and Jude, and deemed it possible to keep the law and reach perfection. Well, see, this is where enough studying they would have understood, they would have gotten to understanding as the Anabaptists should have today, but don't. Why? Because, folks, there's no zeal. The zeal is gone. Many of the Mennonites have gone completely worldly, liberal as some would say, but worldly. So badly, folks, so badly, that in the 1930s and the 1930s, when Hitler came up, many Mennonites in Germany and Europe considered Hitler a hero. Let that sink in. The attitude of the Reformers toward Anabaptists. How the teaching of the Anabaptists impressed Zwingli, we learn from Ranke. Although Zwingli had gone much further than Luther, he was soon opposed by a still more extreme party. He had to contend with the Anabaptists. He was called upon to form a separate congregation of true believers, since they alone were the subjects of the promises. He replied that it was impossible to bring heaven upon the earth. As he said, Christ had taught that they were to let the tares grow up together with the wheat. How the controversy was settled, Dr. Shaw informs us. Zwingli had no mercy on the Anabaptists, who threatened to overthrow his work in Zurich. After trying in vain to convince them by successive disputations, the magistrate under his control resorted to the cruel irony of drowning their leaders, 6 in all, in the Limmat near the lake of Zurich between 1527 and 1532. So as you can see, this great sudden appearance of these Anabaptists began in the early 1500s. But these people, like you said, we just read about the Waldensians and the others. According to Schaff, and this is page 59 and 60 of that particular book that I'm reading out of, Luther's attitude against the Anabaptists at first was, he opposed the doctrine of the Anabaptists with every argument at his command, but disapproved the cruel persecution to which they were subjected in Protestant as well as Catholic countries. It is not right, he said, in a book against them. And this was in 1528. Of course, he changed his mind later on. I deeply regret that such a wretched people should be so miserably murdered, burned, and cruelly be put to death. Every one should be allowed to believe what he pleases. What changed, Martin Luther? I'll tell you what changed, folks. When his sympathy for the Jews turned into violent, vile, despicable hatred for the Jews. When he started hating the Jews and wanted them murdered, he did the same thing to the Anabaptists. Why? Because he viewed them to be the same people. If he believes wrongly, he will have punishment enough in the eternal fire of hell. Why should they be tortured in this life also? However, no less an authority than Dr. A. Harnack remarks after that Luther had come into contact with him, he in many respects really hardened himself in such an attitude of bold defiance toward reason, and then yielded also to the Catholic spirit, which worships in paradox and in contradiction of the terms and the wisdom of, as they say, God, but it should be Jehovah, and sees them in the stamp of divine truth. Luther himself had to suffer for his obscuration, which he subjected his conception of faith. Still greater, however, was the penalty for those who adhered to him, who degraded to a new scholastic wisdom from what he had defiantly proclaimed. The position on which the Reformation took up towards the Anabaptists and towards others who had affinity with him became most disastrous for itself and for its subsequent history. There are, in fact, also many consider, I may have to make this thing smaller, I'm not sure. Yeah, probably do, so you can see it in the window. I'm not sure. There are many, in fact, many considerations that make it fully intelligible why the Reformation simply rejected everything that was offered to it by the enthusiasts, yet in fact remain unaffected thereby. That was the unjust course followed by the Reformers, entailed upon them and their cause the most serious losses. How much they might have learned from those whom they despised. love your neighbor as yourself. Dr. Harnack pays the following tribute to the Anabaptists. But the spirit of the New Age reveals itself among them, not only in their entertainment in many ways of Reformation thoughts, but also in the stress they lay upon Christian independence. It is with this in view that their opposition to infant baptism is to be understood. In this vastly great group also, which had its representatives during the 16th century in Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Venice, Moravia, Poland, Livonia, and Sweden, had the connections with the Waldensians and Bohemians. Please, folks, never forget this. They had their connection with the Waldensians. Not only that, they had an alliance with the Waldensians, as we read further. The more closely into history, the more closely the history of the Reformation in particular provinces and towns has been studied, the more apparent that it has become that these Baptists, these Anabaptists, entered frequently into alliance with Waldensian and Hussite elements, or falling back on former medieval movements, formed the soil on which the Reformation was received, and that for many Iconiums they continued closely interconnected with in many regions. Yes, they considered the Waldensians and the Hussites as their brethren. I wonder who else they considered as their brethren. On the account of their rapid spread and constant increase, a general persecution against the Baptists arose. Papists and Protestants treated them in the same manner. The Episcopalians and the Presbyterians of England. All right, folks, let me ask you a question. Do you honestly want to align yourselves with these people knowing their past? The Episcopalians and the Presbyterians of England, the Lutherans of Germany, the Reformed in Switzerland, differed from one another and, refusing intercommunion, agreed in persecuting the Anabaptists. Well, how do you like that? They were a sect everywhere spoken against. They traveled too fast and went too far. If they could not be stopped by other means, the fire must be ignited or the headsman's axe employed. Beheading. Fifth seal. Beheadings. Who do you think it was talking about in the fifth seal? Thus the men were silenced, or in this way they were silenced. The Emperor Charles V, that's right, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V ordered all the women to be drowned or buried alive, and no judge could mitigate these decrees unless he was willing to be regarded as a protector of the heretics and be proceeded against as such. Notwithstanding the deadly onset was made upon them from all quarters, they spread and increased most astonishingly. Leonard Bowens, an eminent Anabaptist minister in Holland, who died in 1578, left in writing a list of upwards of 10,000 persons whom he had baptized. Menno Simon, and other laborers in the cause introduced great multitudes into the churches. The spirit of reform must have taken fast hold in the minds of the people, or they would not have embraced it so readily a system. Didn't we just read they were Sabbath keepers? Didn't we just read this? What happened to you Mennonites, Amish, and Hutterites? What happened? The profession of which was sure a passport to persecution in its most painful and revolting forms. I will tell you why you are now considering Sunday as your day of rest to avoid persecution. Sunday as a day of rest was put in place by the fake fraud murderer Constantine. Luther and his coadjutors opened the door of the temple of freedom to others, but remained themselves on the porch. They feared to penetrate into the interior. The Baptists, Anabaptists, passed by them and entered in and explored the recess of the holy place. Figuratively speaking, of course. For this they were reviled and oppressed. Thousands of them fell in the fight, but multitudes pressed after them. And you wonder what the fifth seal was about. My question to you, Anabaptists today, who call yourselves Anabaptists, which I'm putting that into question now. I'm questioning you. You're not them. No, you're not. Because I don't believe they would have had an ordum per se, except for by the Bible. How the patience and the faith of the saints shine forth here, and extract from Dr. Beck's history demonstrates. To the Catholics as heretics, to the evangelicals as dangerous opponents of the new church institution, the Anabaptists were a thorn in the flesh everywhere. In Germany, the Protestant rulers exceeded even that of the Catholics in severity. From A.D. 1529, most cruel penal laws were issued, and the Reformer did not only show their approval, but could witness the execution of these laws unconcerned with petty satisfaction. The messengers daring to venture from Moravia into German territory when recognized as Baptists were subjected to such penalties. Okay, so it was recorded in Concerning Sneakers and Hedge Preachers. Luther, for example, urged that no Anabaptists be tolerated in the country and demanded each subject to hand over the hedge preacher to the magistrate. The author of the preface to the History of the Martyrs, A.D. 1610, says of them, "Some were ripped and torn to pieces, some burned to ashes with powder, some roasted on pillars, others were hanged on trees, killed by the sword, or drowned. Many were executed with a gag in their mouth to prevent them from talking. Like sheep and lambs, they were led to the slaughter by the score. Bibles were strictly prohibited in many places." What? What? Bibles were strictly prohibited in many places and others even burned. By whom? By the Protestants and the Catholics. Folks, why do you think that they changed meanings and names in the Bible? In 1611 in Joliet, why do you think this happened? Because they did not want the Anabaptists speaking the truth. And they successfully squelched the truth, folks. They did. Successfully. And your preachers and your congregations, and many of you that are hearing me right now, are children of those who perpetrated these crimes. And to the Amish, the Mennonites, and the Hutterites, who used to call themselves Anabaptists, why aren't you holding on to the doctrines of the Anabaptists, at least the seventh-day Sabbath and the Jews as your brethren? Why aren't you? Well, there was a group who did. There was a group who did, folks. And you know where they're at right now? All of the survivors of that group are living in You ready for it? Israel. I will get to that in a few minutes after I'm sick of reading. Now see, you got to understand, folks, there's like 1,500 and some pages in the Martyr's Mirror. What I'm reading here is just a summary of the Martyr's Mirror, okay? Like sheep and lambs, they were led to the slaughter by the score. Bibles were strictly prohibited in many places, and others even burned. Many were stared and many were tormented in various ways before they died. Others too young for execution, were lashed. Many had to suffer for years in dungeons and towers. Others, having holes burned in their cheeks, were dismissed. And those who escaped all this torture also had to hide in caves and in rocks and in the woods under the ground and searched by dogs and sergeants. Wait a minute. Isn't that written in the Bible? Let me show you something. See if I can find it, folks. I'm trying to remember. See if I can get the scripture in my mind. The world is not worthy. Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11:38. Verse 36, and others had trial of cruel mockings and scourging, yes, moreover, with bonds of imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains, and in caves, and in dens of the earth. All these. All right. So, the ones who the world did this to, in the name of religion, these all have obtained a good report through faith, have not yet received the promise, Jehovah having providing better things for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. In other words, these people were in the days of old. But these here would have to wait for another generation which had to suffer through this. Indeed they did. To sit here, to sit there, and to ignore. You have that book at your home? At your father's house? At your grandparents' house? Do you have that book? And did you ignore that book, The Martyr's Mirror? Maybe you shouldn't. They sang praises to their God, as they say, while being led to execution. Virgins adorned themselves for this occasion as for a feast. Others have smiled at the water, destined to be their grave, displaying manly bravery because they had on the armor of Jehovah, or they exhort the people to repentance before firmly marching up to the stake. Why would they do this? Why would they be happy to suffer this? Because they knew they were going to be in the greater resurrection. That's why. They knew they would be in the New Jerusalem, the holy city that comes down on Mount Zion at the Temple Mount in Israel. They knew this. Being assured of better things, they looked upon the things of this world as a shadow, and they had more patience in their suffering than their enemies in tormenting them. Those people are better than I am. And yet I'm talking about them in their defense on their behalf, so as not to allow this world, their descendants, to forget them, to forget what happened, and not to join these congregations whose fathers murdered them. Erasmus bears the following honorable testimony to them. The Anabaptists have nowhere been permitted to use churches, though they abound everywhere in great numbers. They are to be chiefly recommended for their blameless life, yet they are oppressed by other sects as well as by the Roman Catholics. The following were a few samples of the terms employed against the Anabaptists by the Reformers, by the Protestants. Latimer, pernicious and devilish opinions by the Baptists. Bacon, wicked, apish, Anabaptists, foxish hypocrites, that damnable sect, liars, bloody murderers, both of soul and of body. Oh, he was speaking about himself, wasn't he? Bullinger, obstinate, rebellious, brain-sick, frantic, filthy knaves. Zwingli, pestiferous, seed of their doctrines, hypocritical humility of their speech, more bitter than gall. Luther finally called them sectaries of the devil. And my brethren, the Amish, the Mennonites, and probably the Hutterites too, and you want to use the German Bible, which Martin Luther wrote? Really? And compares their constancy with that of, all right, folks, hold, wait a minute. You ready? Of the Donatists or the Jews at the destruction of Jerusalem. You see, folks, I told you. I said it to everyone that I know. That the Protestants, or the father of the Protestants, and the Catholics, quite frankly, viewed them as a sect of the Jews, therefore being Jews. Now, why do I continue to insist that this is true? And a destruction of Jerusalem being the blind frenzy of Satan. Now, folks, Satan took power in Rome in the days of Caligula. Shortly thereafter, Titus the Roman general, this is after Caligula died, and Satan was there in Rome ever since. Shortly after Caligula died, just a few years later, when they had different Caesars, Caesar Vespasian sent his own son Titus. So that means that Caesar Vespasian was possessed with the devil. And he sent Titus, his own son, to destroy Jerusalem. So Martin Luther is likening the Jews at the destruction of Jerusalem to the devil. It was the devil who was killing the Jews. You can read in Revelation 12. It's not hard to understand what was going on here. So you see here. Now look, can you see this? I have only scratched the surface. Now you got to understand, folks. It's going to be impossible for me to do a whole video with this one article, with this one measly page from a book. All right. Now you see right here. You say Sabbath keepers among the Anabaptists, and you know, even as late as 1500s, these Bohemians not only kept the seventh day scrupulously, but were also called Sabbatarians. Okay, I find from a passage in Erasmus that in the early period of the Reformation, that when he wrote, there were Sabbatarians of Bohemia who not only kept the seventh day, but were also scrupulously in resting on it. In 1310, 200 years before Luther's thesis, the Bohemian Brethren constituted 1/4 of the population of Bohemia and were in touch with the Waldensians who abounded in Austria, Lombardy, Bohemia, North Germany, Thuringia, Brandenburg, and Moravia. Erasmus pointed out how strictly Bohemian Waldensians kept the seventh-day Sabbath. So as you see, and we read earlier in this particular article, how the Anabaptists were allied with the Waldensians. And they got their seventh-day Sabbath observance, the Anabaptists did, from the Waldensians, who are around before they were. Now, like I said, it is impossible for me to go through this whole article in one YouTube video. I hope I don't have to. You know, I will probably have to do more. Maybe what I will do is segment these. I don't know. Okay? But I did go over the other day, Sabbath keepers among the Anabaptists. All right. So, what did Martin Luther, the Protestant, the father of Protestantism, call them? He called them a Jewish sect. What did the Catholics call them? A Jewish sect. I proved that the other day in this very, very article. Now, let me show you this particular article here. The Zeckler Sabbatarians in Transylvania, or Transylvanian Saxon. All right. They were a religious group in Transylvania, Hungary, between the 16th and 19th century who held Unitarian Judaizing beliefs. So clearly, this was a group of these Anabaptists / Sabbatarians who survived the onslaught of Catholicism, Orthodox, and Protestantism. The Magyar Sabbatarians arose among the Transylvanian Unitarians led by Matthias Vehi's followers, Andrus Iosi and Simon Pecci, who founded the Sabbatarians in 1580. So this was going on during this persecution. It was the same people. 1588. After Ferenc David died in prison and the Unitarian Church formalized on a non-Sabbatarian. You see what happened to the Unitarian Church? They went non-Sabbath. They went Sunday. Initially, they believed, as they say, Jesus, but back in those days, the word Jesus didn't exist, folks. And as I pointed out in England, in the English Bible, it was Yehoshua to be Messiah, but a human rather than a divine Messiah. Now, which of these major religions today believed that the real Messiah was completely human? None. Zero. What do you mean, Henry? What are you trying to say? Why do you think the scripture calls him the Son of Man? Why do you think that the scripture calls him the second Adam? He was flesh and blood just like you and me. So how can you say he was a God? Gradually, they passed to read only the Old Testament and to celebrate Torah's feast, follow dietary laws, and strict observance of the seventh-day Sabbath, but not circumcision. Well, that statement is a lie. You know how I know this? You know how I know this? Did you pick it up? Did you pick up the lie? I bet you didn't. It's right there in front of you. But not circumcision? The lack of circumcision does not come from reading the Old Testament or reading the Old Covenant. It comes from reading the Word of Paul. Unbelievable, isn't it? Do you see why you have to be so careful not to let anybody deceive you? That was a lie. So I'm going to continue. Most followers were of Zekli ethnicity and had experienced periods of tolerance and persecution. In May 23rd, 1621, Simon Peccei, the Chancellor of Transylvania, was dismissed and arrested for political reasons at the order of Prince Gabriel Bethlen. On September 29, in the following year, the Transylvania Diet made a law against the Judaizers. Here we go again. They didn't reject the New Covenant or the New Testament, as people say. I've already proven it that they lied. It was a lie right there. When they said they gradually read only the Old Testament, that's not true. Absolutely false. Because the fact that they refused to circumcise proves it. All right. 13 years later, in May 13, 1635, the Diet set up the explicit deadline on Christmas Day, 1635, for the Sabbatarians to convert to one of the four accepted Christian religions of the Principality. Here we go with church and state again. When the Great Persecution began in 1635, they numbered 20,000 members. Starting May 23rd, 1638. Let me move this over. Maybe I hope everybody can see this. Sabbatarian believers were tortured and their writings confiscated in the Kolozvar and Maro, I can't pronounce this. On July 7th, the trial started in Dace. All property of the convicted were confiscated, and they were sentenced to prison by the decree of Prince George Rakoczy to hard labor as well. A Sabbatarian goldsmith from Kolozvar, Janos Torchai, was condemned to be stoned to death. On July 14th, Simon Peccei was sentenced to prison and died the next year. Believers had to practice their Jewish religion in secret. Wikipedia, you should know better. For the next 230 years while pretending to be Catholic or Unitarian, so their numbers were only in the hundreds only when their conversion to Judaism was allowed from 1868 to 1874. It's hard to distinguish some of this as whether they are telling the truth or not, or whether they're slandering these people or not. So you have to be careful when you read this. At the insistence of Dr. Beck, the Bucharest rabbi, Joseph Banowski, and Professor Wilhelm Bacher took the necessary steps to save from ruin the last Sabbatarian congregation in Bezidu, in Romania, and set up schools. In a few generations, most Sabbatarians were absorbed into the Jewish community. The Christians wouldn't accept them, but the Jews would. Imagine that. And if you ask yourself why I refuse to call myself a Christian, therein lies your answer. In 1910 census, 120 people out of the 679 inhabitants of this particular town confessed to be Jewish. During the Holocaust, first, the Sabbatarians were given exemption from the Hungarian anti-Jewish laws of 1941, but in April 1944, during the ghettoization, they were also herded to the ghettos. The local priest hurried to the SS commandant and proved to him that the Sabbatarians are originally not from the Jewish race, but there were numerous intermarriages between the Sabbatarians and Jews in the preceding decades. And there you have it, folks. There you have it. There is your proof that the Anabaptists, Sabbatarians, Waldensians communed with the Jews, were friends of the Jews. It says, so the priest was able to take out some of those people from the ghettos, while the others were sent to Auschwitz. My brethren, my people, my kin, my blood was sent to Auschwitz for being Jews. I hope that I have convinced everyone listening to my videos now the reason why I wear this. Those Jews are my people. They are my kin. My own DNA even proves it. The surviving Sabbatarians emigrated to Israel after the war. Folks, this is a very, very serious matter. You children of Anabaptists should not take your history lightly the way you do today. Yes, you do. You take your history lightly. Why? Why do I say that? Because you're observing the day of Constantine, the oppressor, the father of Catholicism. And Catholicism begat Protestantism. And those two turned into the four major religions of Europe, and they all turned against you and murdered your fathers and your mothers, your ancestors. You should have nothing to do with their religion. Zero. Your brethren are the Jews. That's who your brethren are, folks. Look. Your own DNA proves this. Your own DNA proves this, folks. I'm going to do this. I don't do this, but I'm going to do this one time. Your own DNA proves this. You say you're German, right? Ha ha! How laughable. Well, let me show you something. First of all, concerning the European part. All right? Yes, our ancestors were scattered all over Europe, were they not? You see that? You see that? And this. Yes, they were among the British too. Scattered all over. And then we have Jewish diaspora. Huh. There are many of my relatives who have more Jewish blood than me. How about it, Amish? Huh? You say you're German, right? You say there's no English in you? You call the others English? Ha! You're funny. Look at this. This is the DNA of the Anabaptists, the Sabbath-keeping Anabaptists, folks. Yes, they did have communion with the Jews. Yes, they did intermarry among the Jews, didn't they? I have proof. Absolute proof. All right. All Israel is going to be saved, folks, when the time of the Gentiles comes to an end. The Gentile world, what we call modern day Christianity, which runs the world today, is going to be overturned and overthrown. Its base in Rome is going to be a burning pit. And I don't think any of Europe or any of the previous beasts before Europe, I don't think there's going to be any living people in those locations. It's going to be done to them what they did to my people and to the Jews. They are the ones that are going to be running around looking for a place to live and won't be able to find it. Probably having to move to the Arctic Circle or Antarctica in maybe. But as far away from the Middle East and Europe as they can. It's going to be their turn. Make sure you're not among them when it happens.